At its peak in the 1920s, the British Empire controlled over a quarter of the Earth's entire landmass. It was a dominant global force, a seemingly unstoppable empire that existed for over 3.5 centuries. And yet, within just a few decades, the British Empire would completely disintegrate.
Colonialism is about ensuring that wealth and resources enrich the home nation.
The Second World War was a killing blow to the British Empire, accelerating a chain of events that would see countries withdrawing from the empire en masse, in some cases at the cost of thousands of lives. In this 4-part series, we'll explore the fight for independence from colonial rule by journeying through IWM's latest exhibition, Emergency Exits. But first, in this episode, we need to understand the British Empire as a whole. How did it work? What did Britain gain from controlling so many countries? And why, after centuries, did it all come tumbling down?
Empires are deceptively simple concepts. Fundamentally, an empire is acquired to bring benefit to the nation that owns it. And some places are acquired because they guarantee that that benefit will continue because they're in key strategic locations. Well, although empire is often presented as a much more complex sort of proposition, at its heart, it's about ensuring the benefits flow to the home nation.
This is exactly how the British Empire operated. Each colony directly benefited and enriched Britain and British people. This usually came in the form of resources, with each region contributing different materials to sustain the empire. Historically, this was often at the expense of indigenous populations who were regularly oppressed and abused. Despite Britain formally abolishing slavery in the early 1800s, local populations were still mistreated and exploited across the empire through to the 20th century. Indentured labourers worked in extremely harsh conditions for little to no pay, all the way up to the First World War. When that conflict began, it created a whole new set of challenges for those living in colonised countries.
The empire not only provided resources and soldiers, it carefully managed how it used those resources. And crucially, it carefully managed how it used those people. So the people of empire were restricted to particular roles, often non-combat roles. This is a sealed pattern jacket. So the idea behind things like this is that they were made once, and then this would be the example that all of the manufacturers of these jackets would go back to in order to make sure that their products were the same. And this is a sealed pattern for the South African Native Labour Corps. And the crucial thing about the roles that the guys who wore this performed was that they were support roles. Fundamentally, the British government didn't want black soldiers fighting white soldiers, white German soldiers in Europe. And they also wanted to ensure that the roles that they had were carefully managed and based upon those ideas about what people in the colonies should do rather than a sense of what they could do. So the South African Native Labour Corps was restricted to non-combat logistical roles, portering, fetching, carrying, digging, and so on.
Indian, African and Caribbean servicemen made an enormous contribution to the First World War, helping to secure Allied victory. And yet, after the conflict, their contribution was widely forgotten. As the Commonwealth War Graves Commission concluded in 2021, up to 350,000 people who had served and died for Britain were not commemorated in the same way as their white comrades, or possibly not commemorated at all.
Imagery and the use of imagery is really, really important in wartime. So it's really carefully curated, the images that are put out by each side because they wish to portray themselves in a certain light and their enemies in a very different light. This photograph was taken from a German prisoner of war and shows black people chained, Labour forces that have been recaptured by Germany, the power that controls them. These people are chained in ways that ordinarily would evoke feelings of horror, of disgust, memories of transatlantic slavery. If British soldiers were captured by German soldiers, they wouldn't have been chained by the neck. The types of treatment that these men are receiving here is extraordinarily different to the type of treatment that even enemy combatants would receive when made prisoners. And don't forget, these people are technically on the same side. And here, the person that goes through these images and decides which ones are going to be used to illustrate certain things about the enemy has made a really interesting point and a very revealing point. Because he says that we should be very careful that we're not suggesting that the enemy is doing anything that is necessarily improper by the treatment of these men. Because, as the censor says, it's very likely that this is exactly how British forces would treat, and the quote here describing these men is native delinquents.
At the end of the First World War, the question arose of what to do with the colonies of the defeated German and Ottoman empires. In the end, Britain gained control of several of these colonies through League of Nations mandates, which included control over Palestine, Mesopotamia, and other parts of former German colonies in Africa.
So the addition of former German and Ottoman colonies into the British Empire means that in the 1920s, Britain's empire is huge. It controls around a quarter of the globe.
But while these mandates were part of the British Empire, they did not operate in the same way as other British colonies. The League of Nations oversaw the administration of these territories, with the goal of guiding them towards eventual self-governance. Other empire countries operated differently too. Dominions, such as Canada, Australia and New Zealand, were former colonies with their own governments and a high degree of autonomy, while still remaining under British sovereignty. Crown colonies, such as Kenya, Jamaica and Hong Kong, were more directly controlled by Britain, with a British governor appointed by the Crown, who directly ruled them. Protectorates were under British protection, but with varying levels of control depending on the specific territory and its circumstances. A key turning point came in 1931, when Parliament passed the Statute of Westminster. This granted the Dominions full legislative independence from Britain and formed a commonwealth of nations that were autonomous communities within the British Empire. The statute formalised the shift from imperial rule to a more cooperative and voluntary structure for the founding members, which consisted of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the Irish Free State and Newfoundland. Notably, this freedom was only granted to white-governed and established states. At this point, not a single government of a dominion was made up of the people who lived in the country before European settlers arrived. When the Second World War broke out, the Empire's resources and supply lines became even more critical, as they were now directly supporting the war effort.
This poster that we're standing in front of is a really great illustration of both the extent of the British Empire during the Second World War and immediately after, and also the complex ways in which it was governed. So the thing that it really reveals is kind of one of the purposes, the main foundational purposes of empire, which is to extract resources from the countries that are part of it and bring those resources, or the wealth that comes from trade in those resources, back to the motherland. And that's particularly important during war, because Britain relies upon the empire for all sorts of products, all sorts of natural resources, and of course for labour and soldiers, sailors and airmen who come from these countries. But the crucial thing as we look at it is it talks about those principal products. And one of the things that the British Empire does is that it frequently describes itself, or it is described as something that is a contributory kind of partnership, so that there is equality on both sides. And of course, while many people in these countries were very proud of their links to Britain, very proud of their service to the empire, there remains this idea that fundamentally this is about extracting vital resources in order to continue the war effort.
The resources of the empire allowed Britain to stay in the fight, but access to those resources was coming under threat. As Japan expanded its own empire during the Second World War, many British territories, along with their vital resources, fell under Japanese control. Hong Kong, Malaya and Burma were all rapidly occupied, but most costly of all was the fall of Singapore. Not only was it the largest surrender in British military history, but Britain also lost control of a vital strategic location and access to the crucial raw materials provided by Malaya.
And the fall of Singapore is described by Winston Churchill as the greatest capitulation in British history, a shattering moment for Britain and a great tragedy, because the thousands of British prisoners of war that are taken, the thousands of civilian internees are treated with appalling brutality by their Japanese captors. Many are murdered, thousands are tortured. And then following Japanese surrender, in August 1945, the Union flags return. This particular flag was flown over the municipal buildings in Singapore in September 1945. An empire maintains its power in part by conveying to people that it is uniquely good at governing. And as Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, says, when they see Britain removed from Singapore and the Japanese Empire come in, suddenly that logic seemingly no longer applies. And that is a really powerful realization.
When the war ended, Britain regained control of its Southeast Asian territories. But whilst geographically the empire seemed to be whole once again, socially, politically and economically, it would never be the same.
It cost a lot to fight the Second World War. Britain's economy is extremely damaged, and one of the things that Britain then looks to do is to rebuild, reassert itself on the global stage.
Post-war Britain was struggling. Significant war debt and damaged infrastructure meant economic recovery was far from immediate. Food was still being rationed and housing was in short supply. And so the issue of empire became less significant in relation to all the problems that people were experiencing at home. However, these territories would offer a way to ensure that Britain could rebuild by once again exploiting the resources that they provided.
The interesting paradox at the heart of empire is, of course, they cost a lot to maintain. So in order to bring those resources in order to guarantee that trade, it requires an outlay. Getting that balance right between how much Britain wants to spend on securing its empire and what it is getting from its empire becomes a crucial question here in London.
The Second World War highlighted the unequal relationship between Britain and its colonies, particularly in India. The Bengal famine of 1943 resulted in the deaths of between 2 and 3 million people. Despite no major shortfall in food production, British colonial policies and inflation, along with the denial of aid, caused mass starvation and disease that was entirely avoidable. It was one of the greatest systematic failures in the history of the British Empire. And now, with Britain in a weakened economic position and a new Labour government in power, the Indian independence movement was stronger than ever. In 1947, the Indian Independence Act officially ended British rule and created the two independent Dominion states of India and Pakistan after nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule.
Within 2 years of the end of the Second World War, this jewel in the imperial crown becomes independent. The rest of the empire sees India and Pakistan becoming independent and wants the same thing. If India can achieve independence, what about my country? So many people have come back from the Second World War hungry for change, and the world that they have returned to is also changing. The United States is not prepared to bankroll the idea in perpetuity that European empires are still a good thing. The United Nations has been set up, and its members include countries that are themselves fighting for a better future. All of these things come together in this period. That means by the end of the 1950s, these changes are now inevitable.
Britain's weakened position on the world stage was exemplified by the Suez Crisis of 1956, when Britain, along with France and Israel, invaded Egypt to recover control of the Suez Canal. But the landings received international condemnation, including from several Commonwealth countries. Britain soon backed down under UN and US pressure and was left embarrassed on the international stage. It was a clear demonstration that Britain's future role would have to be in line with, in particular, US interests and aspirations in the growing Cold War. If the Second World War was the fatal blow to the British Empire, the Suez Crisis was the final nail in the coffin.
In the UK, there are different opinions as to the extent to which Britain should maintain its empire. But broadly, within government, the idea is pretty simple. Whatever happens next has to be on British terms.
Over the following 15 years, 15 countries would gain independence, and by 1980, only a handful of territories would remain under British control. However, while independence came easily for some countries, for others the struggle for autonomy would turn deadly. Throughout the 1950s, Britain fought a series of bloody wars in an attempt to retain direct control over its dwindling empire and ensure that the post-colonial future was as rewarding as its colonial one. These conflicts and rebellions would become known as emergencies in Malaya, Kenya, and Cyprus.
So whatever comes next in these countries, Malaya, in terms of its economic benefits, in Kenya, in terms of its relationship with its white settler government and who owns and benefits from the land, and in Cyprus, this incredibly important location. In all of these places, there are real benefits for Britain in maintaining some form of control. And it's that means Britain is prepared to go to war. Visit Emergency Exits, the fight for independence in Malaya, Kenya and Cyprus. Open now at Imperial War Museum, London.